So I wanted to kind of do a video here on some tips of how to set up kind of a more built motor for regular street driving and just to have good street manners overall. So I've dinked around with a lot of different assortments, and I've found kind of with quite a few motors that I've done um, kind of the way that works out best. I'm going to go ahead and start with the carburetor, and then I'm going to move on to kind of my thoughts on intake manifolds, and finally I'll stop at the ignition. So as far as the carburetor goes, I make a lot of carburetor videos, so I'm not going to go too in depth here, but I generally like to run a smaller carburetor, where the engine will still flow up to about 5,500, 6,000, but I'm really not spinning my cars over that, very often. So the lower RPM is usually where stuff lives, so I want to have good response. So, and I also like to have annular boosters with these overlap cams here that are ran in these more hopped up motors. They really benefit from those annular boosters because they atomize the fuel a lot better and you get a lot better burn. So, with the higher lift cams, you don't have as good a vacuum signal through the carburetor, so those really help. I'm going to make a quick mention of PCV valves here. Now I got a messed up setup. This is definitely not what you want to do, where you have two open breathers. Your oil gets dirty and the contaminants don't get filtered out, so I definitely recommend a PCV system. Now if you want to have one open breather, that's fine, but one needs to be hooked up with a PCV and hooked up to the back of the carburetor. Now, not only is this good for the life of your oil, since you're driving it all the time, it's also good that your carburetors are generally actually set up for this, especially with these carburetors that don't have a secondary idle adjustment. So they're kind of designed to get fed with that extra air from the crankcase. So when you don't have that routed and you still have that plugged, like I do in this situation, it tends to idle a little rich. So, which I'm okay with because of the cam, but I could get better efficiency if I were to route that correctly. I wouldn't have to have gone into as much tuning detail as I had to with this carburetor to get the right air-fuel ratio. So what I'm going to move on to next is the intake manifold here, and a lot of people run these big open plenum intake manifolds, but what I've found to really work the best is these dual plane setups, and they can't have a notched out center. And if they have a notched out center, just junk them. It's much better to have a carburetor that has a divider in it, so the dual plane is a true dual plane. So in that effect, the cylinders on this bank are only pulling from one half of the carburetor, and the cylinders on that bank are only pulling from the opposite half. Now that's good because, again, with that overlap cam, you don't have as good a vacuum signal, and this really increases that vacuum signal, and you get a lot better throttle response with this setup, and it's so much more drivable. You lose a little bit of power, I'd say, past 5,500, 6,000. You wouldn't have as much, but I mean, honestly, we're not driving up there all that often. So, and I generally shift at 5,500 anyway, just for the longevity of my motor. But anyway, so I really like running those dual plane split manifolds. They're really nice. And I usually try to accompany them with a carburetor spacer. Now, as you can see here with this carb spacer in particular, it is of a 4-hole design. Now, the name of the game with running these built motors on the street and having that good low-end power is to have good vacuum signal through the carb venturies so the fuel can be atomized to the highest degree. These 4-hole spacers not only keep the engine banks separated, but they also effectively extend the carburetor venturies and improve that vacuum signal and airstream velocity through the venturies. There are many different types of 4-hole spacers, I guess, but you want to make sure that at least the left and the right banks stay divided, or else the positive effects of your dual plane intake will be compromised, because they will have that split part between the two banks. The last thing I'm going to touch on here as a main point is the timing. Now, with whatever duration your camshaft is, there's actually, kind of a baseline of how much initial timing you should run. And then likewise, you need to run, your total timing, no more than 36 degrees to be safe on a street car. So now that's all fine and dandy, and I'll post a chart of, your duration in relation to how much initial timing you should run. So basically this chart is pretty simple, and what it's telling you is that if you have a camshaft duration less than 220 degrees, you're going to want to set your mechanical initial timing to 10 to 12 degrees. And then if you have a camshaft between 220 and 240 degrees, your initial timing will probably land somewhere between 14 to 16 degrees. And that's where I have my car set to, and it runs very well there, and it corresponds to the duration of the cam that I have. And then if you have anything that's between 240 or pretty much higher to 260, you're going to want to run 18 degrees to 20 degrees of initial timing because of that. And again, this is all mechanical timing. You don't want to factor your vacuum advance into this whatsoever. But where you get into problems is with your vacuum your vacuum advance. Now, your vacuum advance is usually set up from the factory to bring in about 15 degrees of timing. So that's all fine and dandy when you're running at 8 degrees of initial timing on a stock motor, so you're in the low 20s there. But with these more advanced initial timings we have to run because of our cam duration, we end up, when we hook our vacuum advance up, it'll be running at way up in the 30 degrees of initial advance range, and that's really not what you want. So you really want to get an adjustable vacuum advance, and I run 15 degrees of timing and 8 degrees of vacuum advance, and that really helps me a lot. And with that, I like to run manifold vacuum for my distributor, and I don't have any problems when I have that. But if I run manifold vacuum on my distributor, or with the stock vacuum advance, I have a lot of problems, because again, I'm bringing in that 30 degrees of timing at idle. So you can kind of get by with running ported vacuum. I don't prefer ported vacuum because you're not getting that extra timing advance that you're supposed to get at idle. You're only getting your mechanical initial advance, which is around 15, 14. Usually, unless you have a really high duration camshaft, you're not up in the 20s. So that's pretty low, and it's not as efficient. So most modern cars, I have some what's called an ultra gauge on some of my cars, and it shows me how much initial advance my modern cars are running. They're running about 21 to 23 degrees of initial advance at idle. So, and that works really well with these old cars as well. So that's generally what I try and shoot for with my vacuum canister. So anyway, again, to go over them, you want to have an adjustable vacuum canister, so you're not bringing in way too much timing, at idle and at cruising. Because at cruising, again, if you're bringing in that extra timing, you'll be at 25 degrees of mechanical timing plus another 15 degrees, and that's way too much again. So you want to be mindful of that. Your intake manifold and your carburetor setup, and then you probably want to run a PCV valve. But remember those few things and get those all set up right, and your car will really, really run well for you, and you'll be very pleased. So that's how I set up most all of my cars, because I do a lot of street driving. So, and it's worked out really well for me. But anyway, there you have it. Pretty much how to set up a hot rod engine for street driving. So there you go.